In 1956, when Harlem was a battleground of racial tension and economic inequality, a single decision made by a man from outside the community would set off a chain of events that would forever change the fate of 6 men. They thought their privilege and power could protect them, that no one in Harlem had the strength to stop them. But they were wrong. They had no idea they were about to face the legend of Harlem himself, Bumpy Johnson. The attack started when a young boy, only 12 years old, was walking home from the corner store. His name was William, a quiet, innocent child with no interest in trouble. He was just a boy trying to make his way through the streets of Harlem. But when a group of 6 men, all from outside the neighborhood, saw him walking alone, they thought it was the perfect opportunity to make a statement. The gang had been running a racket in Harlem, terrorizing locals with their threats and demands. They believed the community had no voice, no protector, until that moment. What they didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson's eyes were already on them, and their time in Harlem was running out. The 6 men, led by a man named Jim Big Red Calhoun, were a group of outsiders from Brooklyn. They were used to operating with impunity, pushing people around with their money and connections. They had no idea what Harlem represented. For them, it was just another turf to control, a place where they could make their mark by intimidating the people who lived there. Big Red, with his arrogant swagger, thought he was untouchable. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a vicious streak. He ran a number of illegal operations, extorting businesses and terrorizing the people in the neighborhood. To him, Harlem was just another prize to be claimed. But his belief in his invincibility was about to be tested. The vultures, as they were called, thought they could break the community's spirit, bend it to their will. They didn't understand that Harlem wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity that would fight for its own. The people of Harlem had lived with hardship, but they had also lived with pride. Bumpy Johnson, more than anyone else, understood that. Bumpy wasn't a man who relied on brute force to make a point. He had built his power on respect and on his ability to know exactly when and how to strike. The vultures didn't understand this. They thought they could push a boy around and get away with it. But what they didn't know was that in this very moment, they had crossed a line they would never be able to uncross. The child, William, was no hardened street soldier. He was a victim. He had no weapon, no protection, except for the man who was about to teach these bullies a lesson they would never forget. The attack on William wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a test of power, a challenge to everything Bumpy Johnson stood for. The gang had crossed a line, one that went beyond violence against a child. It was an attack on the very soul of Harlem itself. It was a reminder that no matter how much power you think you have, there are always consequences. The vultures didn't realize what they had done. They thought their gang, their guns, and their threats would make everyone bow down in fear. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't like the people they had conquered before. He wasn't a politician they could bribe or a businessman they could extort. He was Harlem's protector, a man who had spent his life fighting for justice on the streets. For Bumpy, it wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure the community knew that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law of respect. And when someone dared to hurt one of his own, it wasn't just a matter of fighting back. It was a matter of making sure the message was loud and clear. The moral line had been crossed. The question now wasn't just what would happen to the vultures. It was about what would happen to the community if they weren't stopped. Harlem needed to know that no one could come in and act with impunity. The stakes had never been higher. It all started when William, a 12-year-old boy from a family of hard workers, was making his way back from the corner store. He had nothing in his hands but a small bag of groceries for his mother. He wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble found him in the form of Big Red and his gang. As William walked down the street, the gang spotted him. They saw an opportunity to make a statement. He was alone, vulnerable, and they knew they could intimidate him without consequences. They approached him quickly, their words sharp and cruel. "Hey boy, where you think you're going?" Big Red's voice was heavy with authority, and his tone dripped with malice. William froze. He didn't know what to say. He had never encountered anything like this before. The gang closed in, blocking his way, making it clear that this wasn't a simple confrontation. It was an act of intimidation. "You belong to us now, kid," one of the men sneered, grabbing William's arm. "You pay us or you pay the price." But what they didn't know was that their actions were about to bring about their undoing, because just as they started to push William around, Bumpy Johnson, who had been watching from a distance, stepped into view. And when he did, everything changed. Bumpy didn't need anyone to tell him what had happened. He'd seen it with his own eyes. The kid, just a boy, cornered by 6 men who thought they were untouchable. And while the men thought they could scare Harlem's children into submission, Bumpy knew something they didn't. The streets of Harlem weren't just a place to hustle, they were a home. And when you hurt one of Harlem's own, you weren't just crossing a line, you were making a deadly mistake. Bumpy was calm, as always, his face unreadable. His reaction was measured, but inside he was seething. He walked towards the location, his mind already calculating. There was no rush. He didn't need to pull out a gun or swing a fist. No, he was going to make these men regret every moment they thought they could disrespect his community. And he was going to do it in a way they would never forget. Bumpy's response wasn't based on anger. It was based on principle. He had one goal: to make sure the vultures learned that Harlem had a protector and that no one, not even them, could get away with this. The vultures were still celebrating their supposed victory, unaware of the storm heading their way. They thought they had sent a message. They thought they had made an example of a child. But what they didn't know was that their real lesson was about to come. Bumpy watched them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make his move. He wasn't worried. He knew exactly how this would play out. The gang, with all their arrogance and power, would soon realize that they were dealing with a force far greater than they could have ever imagined. As they partied, thinking they had nothing to fear, Bumpy prepared his final words. Words that would echo through Harlem for years to come. By the time the vultures finished their celebration and began to disperse, the air was thick with tension. They had no idea how close they were to their downfall. While they basked in their false sense of security, Bumpy Johnson was making his final preparations. He didn't need an army. Harlem knew who he was. All he needed was his reputation and the razor tucked carefully into his pocket. But this wasn't just about physical punishment. It was about something deeper. A lesson. A demonstration of power that would leave no room for doubt. The streets began to clear as night fell, the sound of the city echoing in the distance. Harlem was preparing for the inevitable showdown. Bumpy's allies, silent, loyal, and efficient, took up their positions, keeping an eye on the vultures, watching their every move. In the distance, the vultures walked out of the bar, unaware of the storm waiting for them. They swaggered down the street, their voices loud and their steps heavy with the false confidence of men who had been allowed to play God for far too long. Bumpy's plan was coming together. He had no intention of making this a violent confrontation. He wasn't going to waste time. No, this would be a moment of supreme justice, delivered swiftly and decisively. He wanted the vultures to feel the weight of Harlem's code. The trap was set. The stage was ready. All that was left was for the vultures to make their final move. It was 11 p.m. when the vultures finally made their way out of the bar. The sound of their heavy footsteps reverberated in the cold night air as they turned the corner into the heart of Harlem. The city had grown quiet, but the street was far from empty. The people of Harlem had gathered, as if by instinct, to bear witness to what was about to unfold. Red, thinking he had everything under control, swaggered forward, flanked by his crew. "Hey, Bumpy," he called out with a grin, his voice laced with false bravado. "I don't think you know who you're dealing with." Bumpy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood tall in the middle of the street, his back straight and his eyes piercing through the night. His presence alone commanded attention. He didn't need to say a word. The crowd behind him grew still, as though everyone knew the same thing. Justice was coming. Big Red stepped forward again, his arrogance still on full display. "You think you scare me, huh? You think you can—" That's when Bumpy took his first step forward, and everything changed. The street was dead silent. The vultures stopped in their tracks, their expressions faltering as they saw what was in Bumpy's hand, a razor gleaming in the dim light. But it wasn't just the razor that made them stop. It was Bumpy himself, the legend that had walked these streets for decades, the man who had earned the respect of every soul in Harlem. Red's face went pale. The words that had been coming so easily to him just seconds ago caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The arrogance melted from his face like ice in the sun. The other gang members, once full of bravado, now looked at Bumpy with a mix of fear and awe. Bumpy didn't need to raise his voice. He simply looked at them, one by one, and with that gaze, he stripped them of everything they had. "What you've done tonight," Bumpy said slowly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "wasn't just disrespectful. It was a declaration of war. And now I'm here to remind you what happens when you bring war to Harlem." The tension in the air was palpable. The vultures, once so powerful, now stood frozen, not knowing what to do or how to react. "You came here thinking you could take what you wanted," Bumpy continued, his words measured, final. "But you made a mistake, and now you'll pay the price." With that, Bumpy made his move, swift and calculated. He didn't need to strike. His words alone were enough to deliver the justice that was required. What followed was swift, precise, and elegant. Bumpy took a step closer to Red, who was still frozen in place, his mind racing. "You're not leaving Harlem, Red," Bumpy said, his voice firm and unwavering. "Not tonight, and not ever again." Red, finally finding his voice, tried to speak, but Bumpy's words cut him off. "You had your chance to leave with your dignity," Bumpy said, his eyes unwavering. "Now you'll leave in shame." Bumpy's hand moved, and with a single flick of his wrist, the razor gleamed. It wasn't the razor itself that struck fear into the vultures. It was the symbolism of the action. This was Harlem's protector, a man who had long earned the respect of the people, and he was making it clear that there would be no second chances. The message was clear. These men were not welcome in Harlem. Not now, not ever again. They were not to be feared, but to be remembered. They would never have the power to harm Harlem again. The finality of Bumpy's words hung in the air, and Red and his crew, now realizing the magnitude of their mistake, retreated into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as they had arrived. Bumpy stood tall, his eyes scanning the crowd of Harlem's people. The legend had spoken, and justice had been delivered, not through force, but through the unassailable power of respect. The impact of that night would echo through Harlem for years to come. The vultures, once feared and respected, never returned to the streets they had once terrorized. Bumpy Johnson had made sure of that. The community, though shaken by the events, felt a sense of relief. They knew that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of justice, of power, and of respect. And as for William, the boy who had been caught in the crossfire, he was safe, and Harlem had learned a valuable lesson. No one, no matter their power, could walk over them without facing the consequences. The legend of Bumpy Johnson had grown that night, not just because of his strength, but because of his unwavering commitment to the people of Harlem. His reputation was solidified, and the lesson was clear. In Harlem, justice would always triumph over injustice. Bumpy Johnson didn't just protect his community. He defined it. He showed that respect was the ultimate currency, and in Harlem, you didn't get to take what you didn't earn. For the vultures, that lesson came at a cost they could never repay. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot. The moments that made him a legend. The code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Bumpy? More legendary stories coming next day. Don't miss it.